it's Corrine from the Sewing Works, and today I want to give you a great demonstration on how quickly a quilt can get cut and put together using the fabulous Accuquilt system. If you didn't already know, the Sewing Works now is an Accuquilt dealer, which means we have all the cutters and access to all the dies. That doesn't mean I have all the dies in the store, but I can sure get them for you. So if you already have an Accuquilt system and want to add some dies to your cutter, we are offering them through the end of the year, buy one, get one half off. And depending on when you're watching this, we might have some special pricing on the cutting system as well. But let me show you how fabulous this works and show you how much time and accuracy you're gonna save by using the Accuquilt system. I'm gonna be demonstrating on the Go cutter, which is the medium-sized cutter here. And, ooh. It is compact enough to travel with, fairly lightweight, weighs about 9 pounds, I would guess. And it comes with, it's called the Ready, Set, Go package. You're gonna get the dies to make this quilt and 72 other blocks, including a block on board, which means you have all the components to make a block right on one cutting die. A cube, which has all the same shapes that are in the block on board, plus more. This is what's going to give you your configurations for 72 different blocks. And this lovely book, which will show you all the different blocks you can make and how to put them together. And maybe my favorite, especially since I just made this lovely quilt behind me, the 2.5-inch strip cutter. Great for making binding, making your own jelly rolls, all kinds of things. Diamond shapes, you name it. So let me show you how the cutter works. For this block, we're going to be using the 4.5-inch square, which finishes at 4 inches, and the 2.5-inch strips. So I'm going to use my block on board die to cut my 4.5-inch squares. And yes, that's what I use to make all the flip corners as well. So each block requires 5 4-inch squares, or 4.5, depending on what you're talking, finished or unfinished. There is a die that's only the 4-inch square in the cube, but I already have this block on board already opened up. I've cut a strip of black fabric, and I'm just going to lay it. You can do 6 layers at a time. So there's 2, 4, kind of maximize this, and 6 layers just by accordioning that over on the 4-inch square. Oh. And we'll get it started here. Press it through. And one thing to note is you can go either direction. So I can just keep sending this puppy back and forth as I cut all my squares. That's a excess piece. So here we go. Perfectly cut, ready to go into my quilt. Now I'm going to get the strip cutter and I guess I'll go from this end again. The strip cutter requires a little bit more room because it's a bigger die. You're going to line up your fabrics with this line, which is marking where the top of the die is. One, two, three, four, 5, 6 layers. Here we go. I might have to peel these up. So, just like that, excluding my scraps, I just made 6 times 3 is 18 strips. Goes pretty fast. Now let's talk about how to sew them together. Here comes the fun part, the fast and furious sewing, I like to call it. So organize your strips according to size. And you'll find that if you cut them in stacks like I did, all the stacks have the same color on the top. So instead of making a giant mess, if you would like to, you can cut and restack. Let's see, I'll cut this one to that color. Each size so that it's more randomized when you pull. And sometimes I just flip the stack over and work from the back to the front. You'll start with you have a stack of 4.5-inch squares here. Make sure you only get one of these and marry it up with a 4.5-inch strip. Okay, I'm going to try to get this to where you can see me sewing and kind of see my strips. Well, you'll be able to see the strips when I pull them into view. Let's just get over here to the sewing machine. Okay. Line up my raw edges and sew my 1/4 inch. Now, the extra speedy way to do this is to sew two blocks at a time, because that allows one block to act as a fabric fairy for the other. So I've got that one under my needle. Now I'm going to come in with the next block. Start it out just the same. I'm a big fan of finger pressing. So I take the back piece off of the chain and press. Now I'm ready to go to the next size. You have 2 of the 6.5s before you move to an 8.5. Now we have our first round of colors built into our block. So it's time to start doing flip corners. So we'll grab another 4.5-inch square, and it doesn't really matter which corner you do it to. You're gonna line that up with the edges of your block. And then, if you prefer to mark a line, you can draw yourself a line from this corner to that corner. I find that I either use my handy dandy laser light, or I kind of put my finger where I can feel that seam and I just aim for it. Again, this is fast and furious. So I start at one corner, get my finger lined up where the middle point's gonna be. So towards my finger, and then towards the corner. And you'll see how that's going to turn out after I get this next one started. Again, doing 2 at a time so that I have a fabric fairy built in, or a leader piece. Okay. You can trim this seam allowance if you want. Not for me, it takes too much time. I'm just gonna finger press that and leave it. Now we're gonna repeat for the opposite corner. It is important that you pay attention to which corner is opposite. Okay, inner round is done. Now we're going to repeat that whole process again for the outside of this block. Once you've made a stack of these beautiful blocks, we're going to take it over to the ironing board. I like to give it a spritz of water or light starch and then press it flat. Now, because we sort of did a down and dirty sew job where we're chain piecing and finger pressing, I may have a little bit of squaring up to do. So I'll take you over to the cutting table and show you how I'm going to do that. It's going to end up, for me, that my block's squared down to about 12 1/4 inches. It doesn't really matter what you have to square down to as long as you're consistent. And honestly, with this big piecework, these big shapes, you don't notice if it comes down even a 1/2 inch to get that square. I've got this over at my cutting table, and I like to use a 12 1/2 inch square to square these up. And I usually will cheat the ruler off to my left and the bottom of my block. And then I'm checking to keep the lines of the ruler to stay pretty straight with the piecework. And just to trim that nice and evenly. You can see I have this little dog ear here that's going to be a bit of an issue for me. So I want to make sure I get that one off before I start sewing my blocks together. You're not going to take off a lot. You're just going to be making that square. Now, this is where you can double check that you are only taking the same amount off of each block. So your 1/4 inch and your 1/4 inch, or whatever you end up trimming down to. This direction might not need any trimming. Give it a little bit off the black. All right, now we just have to make sashing, and we're about ready to have a quilt. Once you have your blocks made, it's time to cut your sashing strips. So we're going to layer up more black fabric that we've cut wider than 7 1/2 inches. I usually cut these 8 or 8 1/2, whichever you prefer. Line the fold edge up on that dark line. Well, that's actually 2 layers, 4 layers, 6 layers. I know it's hard to see black on black. And put the mat down. And we're cooking again. You need to do this 6-layer process twice to make enough sashing. Let me bring it back over here and show you. Staticky. We have 2, 4, and 6 here, and 3 of them stuck to my mat. Let me give you a quick rundown of what you're going to need to make this quilt. I lovingly call this Jan's quilt because my dear friend Jan is the one who had made this in a class, and then I saw her with hers and I absolutely fell in love with it. I couldn't figure out how she made all the fun shapes look like they were creating boxes or flowers, and then she explained to me how it went together, and I thought, how genius. So now I've made my own, and this pattern is one of my favorites because it will, you will see, you can sew very fast and very quickly and minimal pressing, and it turns out beautiful every time. You will want 4 yards of black background fabric if you're using the Go cutting system. You can get by with about a 1/2 yard less if you're going to cut by hand with a ruler. However, I promise you, the $6 or $7 that you're spending on the extra 1/2 yard is so worth the time saving if you have the tools. And you will also need some bright colorful fabric to create your petal shapes. I chose to use 18 different fabric colors, and I needed a fat 1/4 of each. Each block contains 8 strips of color. So if you only use 9, you're not going to have a very random pattern, but you can get away with 9 1/2 yard cuts if you don't want 18 fat 1/4s. Hopefully that makes sense. So then you'll just load them up in your die, cut them out, and start sewing. Thank you for joining me for this fun demonstration and this fast and furious quilt block. Hopefully you'll be inspired to make one of your own. See you next time.